So we previously left off building our entire folder structure. And what I want to start doing now is thinking about configuring our store with Redux. We want to create the store, and we want to pass that store to our app component using the provider component and configure the router here as well. But before we start working on the presentation, let's think about some of the Redux logic that we need. Let's start in our reducers, and let's make a file called index.js. This is going to be the root reducer that we export out. So let's import combine reducers from Redux. And here, let's bring in some reducers that we're going to make. Well, what reducers do we need? Let's go start with a reducer called errors.js. This is going to be a very simple reducer that's going to display errors to the user. Inside of this reducer, we're just going to first need to create some action types. So let's think about all the action types that we need. This application should be able to add an error and remove an error. These will simply just be some error messages that happen if things go wrong, if we fail to create a message, some invalid username or passwords, whatever it may be. These are some generic errors. So let's export out a constant called addError, and that's just going to be the string addError. We're going to do the same thing with removeError, Command D to select the next occurrence, and we'll call that removeError. What other kinds of action types are we going to have? Well, if we think about what our application does, it's going to load a bunch of messages, and also we should be able to remove messages. We're not too worried about that yet, but there's one more action type that we want to make, and that's going to be called setCurrentUser. And currentUser is the idea of the user who is logged in currently. And that's something that we're going to keep in the Redux store. We're going to know in the Redux store who the user is that's logged in, and this will help us navigate to certain pages, ensure that we have the correct user, and so on. We'll call this set_currentUser. So these action types look good for now, but these action types are going to be used in two different reducers. First, they're going to be used in our errors. So let's start here. What do we need inside of this reducer? Let's first import those action types that we made. So we'll bring in addError, as well as removeError. I'm not too worried about what's going to get us to this reducer. We're not going to worry about the actions yet, but let's go bring in these action types. Same thing as action type /index, like we saw before. So what we're going to do is export a default function. This will have some kind of state, which we can initialize as an object with a message and a key, with a key of message and a value of null. We'll assume there's no error message to start. Inside of here, we're going to switch based off of the action type. This is the pattern that you see very commonly in your reducers. You could use if-else statements, but you'll see switch case statements quite a bit. So we're going to say if it is the type of addError, we'll return whatever our previous state was, spread out that object along with a new key of message and a value of action.error. Inside of here, we're going to get some kind of new error, and we'll put that into our state. In the case of removeError, we're simply going to return a new object and spread out state, but message is now going to go back to being null. And if it's not any of these, it's the first Redux dispatching action, we're just going to return the state by default. We have a very simple errors reducer right now. All we're trying to do, if we need to add an error or remove an error, is a really great way to have a generic error handler for all different kinds of errors that we just add and remove as we work in different components and so on. So that's all we're really going to do right here. What we also want to start thinking about is a currentUser. So inside of our reducers, we're going to make a new file called currentUser.js. And we're first going to import our action types of setCurrentUser. And we'll bring that in from action types. And once again, we're going to create some kind of default state. Previously, we did that as a default parameter over here. But if our object gets a little bit bigger, it's sometimes nicer to isolate that into a separate variable. So I'll make a constant called default state. Very commonly, you'll see constants all in caps, so don't be too alarmed, that's just convention. We're going to make a couple properties inside a default state. We're going to have a Boolean called isAuthenticated that will default to false. And then we'll have a property called user, which is going to start as an empty object. This will eventually be all the user information when they're logged in. And this will hopefully be true when the user has logged in. So we're going to use this reducer so that when a user logs in, we can easily know who that user is, and B, that they've logged in. When we log out, we're simply going to change a user back to an empty object and is authenticated back to false. So all we want to do here is actually just handle one type, which is that setCurrentUser. But first, let's export a default function. We'll set that state to be the default state using default parameters and an action. And here once again, we're going to switch on the action type. And here we'll look for a case of setCurrentUser. And when that happens, we're going to return a new object. How are we going to change our state? This one's going to be a little bit tricky. In JavaScript, there isn't a very easy way to figure out from a Boolean standpoint if this object doesn't have any keys. So what we could write is something like isAuthenticated is the result. Let's first make sure we spell that correctly. That's going to be object.keys action user dot length greater than 0. So what this will return on its own is a Boolean. If the user is authenticated, there's more than one key inside of user, which means that length is going to be greater than 0. You'll also see some fancier programming where people will do not. So what does that do? And that's going to turn an empty object into false, or if there are keys, true. So we're simply saying, is this length 0? Because remember, 0 is falsy. And all that these two nots are doing is converting something into a Boolean. It's the same as using the Boolean constructor right here. So we could write it that way or the other way. And you will actually see code like this sometimes. True or false, are there keys or no keys in this object? The second thing we'll do is simply make a property called user, which is going to be action.user. We're going to get an entire user object inside of this action that's dispatched. And then we're going to place some of it in our Redux state. And we'll use that information also to determine if the user is authenticated or not. Finally, if there's nothing inside of here, we're just going to default to our initial state. So if there's a current user, we're going to return an object with a Boolean of is authenticated and our user object. You might be wondering how we're going to do logout. Well, we're actually going to run setCurrentUser again, but we're going to pass in an empty object. That way we don't need another entire action type of setCurrentUser and removeCurrentUser. You might be wondering where this is all going to fit in, but this is really just some setup. So instead of giving you all this code, we want you to walk through and ask us questions if you're stuck on anything. So I have a currentUser reducer and an errors reducer, and now it's time to bundle those together. So I'm going to do that using the combine reducers function from Redux inside of my index.js. Let's import our reducers, currentUser from /currentUser, and we'll do the same thing with errors as well. Import errors, Command D to select, we'll call that errors. And here we're going to make a function called rootReducer, and this is going to be the result of combine reducers with all of our reducers. We'll pass in a key of currentUser and a value of currentUser. Since we're using object shorthand, we'll just let the keys and values be 1, and we'll pass in errors as well. And finally, we'll export this default rootReducer. So what have we done here? We've made 2 reducers, one for the current user, one for our errors, and we've made an index.js that combines or bundles those reducers into a root reducer. In the next screencast, we'll take these reducers and pass them to our store so we can start configuring and creating our store.